So the time had finally come when I had to leave Savusavu. I'd done as much work on the mast as I could there, but there was no crane that was large enough to put the mast actually onto the boat. So I had to go to the other big island, Viti Levu, where there was a large marina called Vuda Point. And to do that, I would have to cross a body of water called the Bly Waters. Now, this is a stretch about 20 miles in distance, and it was named after Captain Bly, who was the commander of the Bounty, an actual person who traveled through there after he had been basically kicked off of his boat. And this body of water is kind of known to occasionally be very rough, but fortunately it was a good day for the crossing, even with the mast on the deck, which tends to make it very unstable. So as we got to the island, here you see Phil, my companion on the way up there. He was a great help to me. Here we are arriving in what's called Sowena Bay, and this was where I was going to wait until it was possible to go to the marina. And it was a very sheltered place, very nice people there. Here's Phil doing a few photo ops with the son. As I said, he was a great worker. He helped me he was a great help. Now here's my boat. Obviously I was looking pretty unusual in the bay. And about this time I ran into a friend of mine, Bruce, who was, I'd met him on the other island, and he had a large catamaran called Sabenga that he used for fishing charters. And so Bruce was a big help, and this is his girlfriend and their dog. This is, I believe the dog's name is Gracie. And so finally Bruce and us went up to the marina. This is Vuda Point Marina, a full-service marina where I was going to continue to work on the mast, get the boat painted, and have the mast inserted onto the boat. This is the clubhouse, which was a good place to relax at the end of the day, have a few beers. Now here you see the travel lift. This is the machinery that takes the boat out of the water. You put slings underneath it, and then it transports it to a spot on land where props are placed underneath it, and that allows the boat to be painted. Here we've painted the bottom of the boat. I never did get around to painting the top sides, although it needed it really badly. There was just too much to be done. So we were able to get the bottom painted. Here you see the boat, the finished paint job. But the biggest thing was going to be the mast. And here you see the bottom of the mast, and you can see the wires and places where the ropes go up, the lines go up. And so all of this wire had to be purchased locally, which was a thing in itself. Here you see the light at the top of the mast. This is the one you use for traveling, so that people know which direction you're going in. You also see the antenna for the radio. There were also some instruments up there. But this is an unusual thing. It looks kind of like a gravestone, but it's actually a thing that was inserted into the bottom of the mast so that it could fit into the socket on the very bottom of the boat. And it had to be worked on quite a bit. Here you see Phil. He's actually drilling holes because this piece was bolted to the bottom. Here the crane is lifting the mast and bringing it over to my boat, which was in the water. And of course I was very nervous at this point because I put a lot of work into this mast. All the wire, all the stays and so forth that hold the boat up. And here you see it's actually been put onto or inside of the deck of the boat. And the hole in the deck had to be enlarged because the mast was much bigger than the existing opening. So that was a task in itself. All the rigging had to be attached and tightened, and things have to be tightened to a certain degree so that the mast stays perfectly upright. And here I am, and believe me, this was a happy moment in my life to have another mast put on the boat. At times I thought it would never happen, but it did, and I owe a lot of people thanks for getting it up and being able to travel again. But of course I had to check out everything, so I climbed up to the top of the mast. There are steps, and so I took some pictures of the marina from up there, and that's the area that I was going to have to go. Now I had to go and check it out. This is my friend Grant Gardner, and he was a big help. I first met him in French Polynesia, so he agreed to go out with me on the test or the trial run, and that was pretty courageous of him, I think. But things went fairly well. I put the sails up and went out, but unfortunately I was heading out towards the Marshall Islands. I went about a couple hundred miles, and things started to break down. First it was the autopilot, then the sail tore, so I had to come back. And so I used this, looks pretty goofy, but it's really a bunch of elastic bungee cords that I used to hold the wheel in place because I had to sleep, and since there was no autopilot, I had to experiment with different ways of keeping tension on the wheel to keep it going in pretty much a straight line. So my first attempt to escape from Fiji was aborted, you might say. I had to return, and it was a bunch of people that I knew. This is my friend Al, and Al, I first met him in Tahiti. He's a very skilled guy. Here he's helping me with my computer program for navigation. Al and his brother Phil are two single-handers that have boats, and I ran into them throughout my trip through the Pacific. Both of them very accomplished sailors. I believe now they're both in Australia, kind of stranded there during the pandemic, but they were both great help. He also helped me to set up kind of an alternate autopilot. This is something that I could hook up in case my main autopilot failed. So when I finally left, the Fijian people gave me a singing send-off, and it was really nice, but I think they were kind of glad to see me go because, you know, I had stayed there a long time. I was always working, and but it was really nice that they did that. So this is the last view I had of Fiji. And about 2 days out, I had this visitor on my boat. It's a blue-faced booby, and it landed on the back, the stern of the boat, and it stayed there for several days. So the booby stayed there for several days, and it was nice to have some company. And so here I am arriving at my first stop. This is Tuvalu, also known as the Ellis Islands. And it took me about 5 days to get here. It's an atoll, like most of the areas on the way to Majuro. And that's where I was heading. I was heading towards Majuro in the Marshall Islands, which is about 2,500 miles away. But I had these stops on the way. So here I am in Tuvalu. I stopped to get fuel, and I just looked around a little bit. One of the interesting things, they had an agricultural project that was run by some Korean organization, and they were growing organically grown vegetables. And to do that, they would collect mulch because there wasn't much topsoil. Now here you see me and the Korean owner and two sailors, this Matt and Annie. I first met them also in French Polynesia, and I would run into them also in Majuro. But we took a tour, and they gave us some vegetables. This is a cruising, or rather just a small canoe that's used for inter-island travel in Tuvalu with an outrigger on the side. And these are used by most of the people in the South Pacific and the North Pacific for that matter. And they're made completely by hand. But eventually it was time to leave Tuvalu to go to the next group of islands called Kiribati. And here I am, this is my GPS showing that I'm crossing the equator. And this was the first time that I'd been back in the North Hemisphere for, I believe, about 3.5 years. So it's usually sort of a big event. Although I was by myself, I still acknowledged it. And so I arrived in Kiribati on the island of Tarawa, which was the scene of a big battle during World War II, where many thousands of people on both sides were killed, mainly because of the tides. It was very shallow to get into the lagoon, so there were some errors in the timing of the attack, and so consequently a lot of people lost their lives there. But they still have the remains of the battle. Here you see cannon on the beach, Japanese cannon. And there was evidence of the war everywhere you went. And actually the sanitation wasn't all that great. Now during my brief stay there I had to get water, and so some people told me about a place where I could collect rainwater that they said was good to drink, and I did that. I put it into bottles, and that actually became a problem later on, as you'll see. So I left Tarawa to go to my final destination, which was going to be Majuro in the Marshall Islands. Now here I've arrived in the Marshall Islands, and it's a place where a lot of fishing boats stop and offload their catch. But unfortunately when I got there I had been drinking this water from Tarawa for several days, and I had contracted an amoebic infestation. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I knew I was really sick. So I had to go to the hospital, and I didn't have a dinghy, so I had to kayak in. I went to the hospital, and I ended up having to stay there for 3 days, and it was a pretty crazy experience. It was not very up to date. The sanitation facilities were not that great, but I survived, and I finally got rid of the amoeba infestation, and I got back to trying to enjoy the Marshall Islands. But I was still really tired from the whole effort of getting the mast and all the work involved, and it soon became apparent that I had a hernia, which I'd never had before in my life. I'd always been very healthy, but it was obvious, and I didn't want to go to the hospital and have the operation done there. So I decided that I would travel to the Philippines. So I bought a plane ticket. I went to the Philippines, where I'd been several times before, and I arranged to stay at a place in Manila where the operation was going to be done. And I went there, and it was quite an interesting experience, getting an operation, not knowing anyone there, trying to get the money for the operation. So, but I was fortunate because I had a contact in Manila, a lady called Evelyn, and she was very helpful in getting me around, finding the right hospitals, talking to the doctors and things like that. So I finally got to Manila. Now here you see a jeepney. This is one of the main forms of transportation in Manila. Here's Evelyn. We're at a little park there. I think we were going to a hospital, and we just stopped in here for a little bit. But she was my landlady also, and so I was very fortunate. The Filipino people are very kind and helpful, and they love to help people. So I was happy to have that experience. Here's a small thing called a tricycle that are sometimes used. This is called lechon. It's basically a roast pig, and it's sold everywhere on the street, and you can buy one if you have like a celebration. And after the operation, which went fairly well, I took a little bit of a vacation. I went to an island nearby just to kind of relax and recuperate. This is a native village, and here I am on the top of one of the hills in Puerto Galera. But finally I returned to the Marshall Islands after about a month in the Philippines, and I began to really be able to enjoy Majuro. And it was a beautiful place. There were a lot of little islands to explore. We did some hikes because you could actually walk between the islands at low tide. So one day a bunch of us sailors went to this island. Now this is the same couple, Matt and Annie, who are now in Majuro. And so I just began to just kind of settle in. I still had a lot of work to do in the boat. Sometimes I would go to this island. Now this is a family that came out. They had found this floating bit of styrofoam, and so the whole family came out to visit me one day. And this is the island itself, really beautiful. And one of the big things in the Marshall Islands are the sailing canoes, and they have a long tradition of sailing between islands. In fact, they were really masters of navigation and sailing. And so they would have these little regattas inside the lagoon. You can see the big ships in the background. They would also have fishing. That's a marlin that had just been caught. And of course the sunsets were spectacular because, you know, it was a lagoon and you usually get some pretty impressive colors in an atoll. So I went up to the very end of the atoll and I checked it out, saw people on the beach there. This is low tide. Those little mounds are a type of a worm that makes these burrows. And so that was Majuro. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you.